Hi everyone, in our last video we had completed our final three card layouts, so now we have a total of five. We have a card feature, a card main primary, a card feature hero, a card main secondary, and then just the card main. With all these cards completed, which we can see here, the five types, this is our card feature, our card main primary, our card feature hero, our card main secondary, and then our card main here at the bottom. It's time to move on to a page layout. As you can see in our final version, we have our cards laid out across spaces so that if we inspect this, we can see that we have a container that is divided into grids, and we're going to be using a grid system that's using a library, our first CSS library for Web Design 1. So you can see these two grids are designed to take up half the space, and then the grids inside here, the top one takes up 100% of the space, and then these two grids take up half the space. And inside any of these columns or grids, we have our cards that always take up 100% of the space that it's given. So as long as our grid lays out the way we want it to, then our cards will take up all the space we want to. And you can see these take up about 66% of the space, and these about 33%, or maybe it's 75-25. And so you can see that this is part of what we call a grid system. And we're going to be using a really simple grid system created called Gridlex. And so I'm going to describe how this works and show you the basics. So Gridlex is a grid system which is built around a 12 column grid. So the idea is that if the grid is divided as a column is 12, there's 12 of them that make up an entire row. All right. So if we say, and we're going to look at this version right here. So if you say column 12, that means you want it to take up the entire space of the grid. So 12 columns, it takes up the entire space, where 11 and 1 make up 12, 10 and 2, etc., etc. So a 50-50 split would be column 6, and these two effectively make up a 50-50 grid system. So if we inspect this to see how this works, the idea is that we have here a grid, all right? And inside that grid we have our columns, okay? And the grid is a flex container. You can see it's display flex, and it uses the flex flow property, which combines flex direction and flex wrap. And so it's always on row and always on wrap. So every flex item, which is a column, so every column becomes a flex item, all right? So each flex item has defined within it an amount of space it's allowed to take. So as the flex item, this one, a column 12, is using 100% of the space, all right? So it's a flex spaces of 100%. Whereas you can see we'll go down to column 6, all right? And as you would hopefully suspect, column 6 is going to take up only 50% of the space. And so what we're going to be able to do is create these columns, and inside a column we're going to be able to put our cards. Right here you can see they have a div that's a demo, but imagine our div is going to be class card and the particular type of card or sets of cards that we put in there. And so the nice thing is this allows us to arrange our cards based on a grid system where we start with a grid and then we divide it into columns, whether they take up 100% of the space or say 2/3 of the space or 3/4 of the space, or in this situation half the space. And since they are flex row, and then we're going to learn about in the next video how these little modifiers, all right, allow us to deal with responsiveness so that it changes how much space they take up depending on the width of the system. So to get started though, we need to use this CSS file as part of our document. Now there's two ways to do this. Gridlex has a CDN, so you technically could just copy this link tag and paste it into the head of your document, and that's one way to do it. But we're going to download the system. In order to use a CDN, system. And you can see it ends with .css, so you're linking to the CSS file. But this is an HTTPS file, link, so that means you have to be connected to the internet to use this. So if you want to make sure that you can still work on your files while you're not connected to the internet, if that becomes an issue, it's best to just download the CSS file and attach it locally to your document. And that's what we're going to do. So we're going to download a zip of this file, all right? And then you can see that we can look in this directory, and in the distribution directory, there's the minified version and the regular version. We're going to look at the regular version so we can actually read it a little bit. And so when we're in our document here, you can see right now we have our CSS directory with just our style.css, and we're going to add Gridlex.css to that directory. All right. And now that Gridlex is there, you can see there's our class, our selectors. We have the grid selector, we have column selectors, and you can see there's that every grid is a flex box with row and wrap defined. And then as we move through the columns, you can see that their core system is basically based on the size or the column length. It's going to be 100% across, 50% across, and this is using the grid version, but the column version we can get down there. And here we go. You can see columns right here. So here's our column 6, right? It's going to take up 50% of the space. So knowing how this works, we can look at our file here, and the first thing we're going to do actually before we start implementing the grid is in our demo we had our container taking up a small amount of space. We want our container to take up more space. All right, so you can see the default width of this space is much bigger than this. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is actually affect our CSS file with a couple minor changes to the container. So if we look at our CSS file, the style.css, and we can scroll down to the page layout, and we're going to change the container so that its max width is no longer 60 but 102 rem, which will make it basically 1020 pixels wide. And that's it for right now. And you'll see now it takes up much more space, similar in width, and now we can start dividing. All right, so remember this syntax here. We need to make a grid and then we need to put columns inside of it. All right, so let's start doing that. So we need to work in our HTML document to do this work because the CSS is written. We're not going to be writing CSS for the most of this tutorial except for the piece we just wrote. For the most part, we're going to be implementing the CSS that's given to us, knowing how it works in our HTML. So our container needs to have inside of it a grid. So we say .grid, all right? And inside of that grid, we need to have two columns. So we need to have, if you think about it, the way that this grid system's set up, let's go back and look at the example. And it's really nice to look at the example to help understand this. So we need to have inside two columns, col-6. We need two of these, all right? So we're going to have inside of it .col-6, and I'm using Emmet syntax here, and we're going to say times 2, and that makes two divs with two columns, all right? And right away, what we're going to do is we're going to take the feature card, and we're going to copy it, and we're going to paste it in the first column, all right? And we'll collapse that so you can see. And then we're going to paste the main card, copy, the main dash primary card inside the other column. All right, so each of these columns is to take up 50% of the space. They're all inside the grid. Okay, so we'll put these below. Those are just where we're going to be grabbing cards from. But you can see the main container here is, let's have a grid with two columns that take up 50% of the space because 6 is half of 12 because it's a 12 column grid. And let's have a look. Okay, you can see something. Oh, it helps to remember to attach the Gridlex CSS file. So I apologize. As we described, we have to add the CSS file, but in order to use the actual CSS, we need to link to it. So let's link to that CSS file. All right, and it is CSS Gridlex CSS. And let's get rid of this extra stuff right here. Now if we save and we go back, there we go. That's what we were looking for. So you can see our feature card is taking up 50% of the space and our main card is taking up 50% of the space at the top, just like our model. So now we need to create another space where we can put all of our secondary cards. All right, we want to have a total of 8 of them in 2 more columns. So one of the nice things about a grid system like this is we can have nested grids. So in the grid system, if we scroll down, any column can become a flex container, just like we're used to working with. Flex containers can have flex items, and those flex items can also themselves become flex containers. So that's what we have exactly here. So if we look at this grid, all right, you can see that here's the grid right here, all right? And this grid has these columns right here that are at the top for the labels. And then we have this grid that's really the example to identify. All right, but you can see the second grid, which is also column 6, and ignore the modifiers for now, this underscore SM-12, but it's col 6, so it takes up 50% of the space, and then col 6 takes up 50% of the space, but you can see the class grid has been added to this column. All right, so this column is now also a grid. Okay, and so what that means is we can put columns inside it now and divide up its space as they're doing here. So this first column takes up a third, and then this one takes up 2/3, because 4 divided by 12 is a third, 8 divided by 12 is 2/3, and inside that grid you can see that it again, we have a bunch of columns. You say take up 50, 50, and then a third, a third, a third. All right, and since these wrap, we get to just see those wrap around. Okay, so what we're going to do is in our second grid, all right, we have our main primary, but we're going to create another, we're going to allow this to be a grid. All right, and to be explicit, we're going to wrap this primary card with a col -12. All right, so we're going to say that main card should be inside a column that takes up 100% of the space, or all 12 columns in this space. So column 6 is now a grid. So right now nothing should have changed. If we have a look, we save and we go back, you can see that it's still taking up 50% of the space. All right, so on the left side, let's get up here, right, there we go. And the right, so we have on the left side the column 6, and then we have column 6, but it's also a grid now, so we can put new columns in there. And we said the first column is going to take up 100% of the space, but now we can add more columns, and inside of those we can put secondary cards. So what we can do is create a .col -6, and inside here create a bunch of secondary cards, and inside of here we can create a col -6 and also put a bunch of secondary cards. So we have a whole bunch to add, so we're going to rename these secondary, all right, so that they appear. We like to use all our different cards with their different text and images, but we need to name them secondary cards for the sake of the exercise. And we have two more. All right, and so we're going to put 4 in each column. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. Copy. And we'll put them in this column. Paste. And again, notice I'm using my arrows here to make sure it's really easy to see where things are nested. All right, so we have now 6 secondary cards inside of column 6. So let's save this and have a look, and you can see there's our 4 secondary cards in that column that takes up half the space. All right, and then we can do the same on the other side. So if we scroll down, we made 1, 2, 3, 4. So let's take these 4 afterwards. 1, 2, 3, 4. And move them into, again, this second column that takes up half the space because we've defined it as a call-6. All right. So here we go. We have a container that has a grid inside of it. All right. It has 2 columns inside that grid, call-6, call-6. So this grid makes these 2 divs flex items, and they take up 50% of the space each. But this second one, we also made a flex container by adding the grid class, which allows us to add a number of columns. All right, the first one being that takes up 100% of the space, and then 2 more, each taking up 50% of the space. And since they're wrapping, it goes to the next line. All right, inside each of these 50% columns, we have 4 cards. All right, and so this is the basics of a grid system. Okay, and if we go back, you can see now we are matching. We still have our extra cards at the bottom, but you can see that these are taking up the amount of space that we intended it to, just like here. Okay, so in the next video, we're going to do our second container, and with some modifications to it. You can see this takes up a slightly less space. Okay, width-wise, there's a little extra space on the side here. And we're going to make 2 more columns, and it'll be very straightforward, and I'll see you soon.